This is Dan, and this is the Napkin Academy. Our lesson now is 6x6 picture type number 4, which we might recall is the timeline. The timeline, which is the picture that we draw when we want to describe the when part of our problem or our idea. The when part, of course, means the part that relates to the passage of time. When do things happen? Now, we might recall that our first three slices, who and what, how much, and where, were all happening quite literally at the same time. And let me show you what that means. So while we were looking at our simple picture, as our mind's eye is doing, of course, thousands of times a second, one of the first things that we were noticing, of course, is we were noticing who and what. So we got rid of that, where what pathway accounted for who and what. And then we were counting number, and our how much pathway took care of that. And then we were noticing the distance between things, and our where pathway took care of that. But now something new is going to happen. We're going to add all of those up, the what's plus the how much's plus the where, and we're going to see when things change over time. Now watch this. So here's my picture at one point. Let's call this, as we remember, point A. And here's my same picture at point B. And look what's happened. The same objects are now, in some cases, in different places. So isn't that interesting? The same what, the same airplane in this case, the same what, in the same quantity, has changed its where. What has happened is a change of where. And the only thing our mind's eye can deduce when that's happened, and here we see it again, is that time has changed, time has passed. And that's what our when pathway is noticing. It's almost like watching an animation. In fact, it's exactly like watching an animation. We see where something was at one point, we note it. We see where something is at another point, we note it. We see where something is at another point. What do we mean by another point? Well, another point in time. We're not saying that this is a different person than this one. Same person. All that's changed is their where. The only way to account for the same thing changing its where is, well, time must have passed. When must have passed. So, okay, let's talk specifics about picture type number 4, the timeline. So this is 6x6, type number 4, the timeline. And let's come up with an example, something very simple, of course. The typical timeline looks something like this. Well, you know, A happened, and A was followed by B, and B preceded C, and in the end, we ended up with D. So there's our very typical timeline. They usually move, as we talked about a long time ago. In Western cultures, they move from left to right. That's the way we typically perceive the passage of time, and that's almost always the way we make our timelines go. Culturally specific, but you know, it's a standard that we might as well stay with, because for most of us, we look at it and we understand what we're showing. So what, of course, does a timeline show? Well, it shows when. More specifically, it shows the events in the passage of time. This happened, then that happened, then this other thing happened. The coordinate system that we use is a simple one, and it almost always goes the same way. It's kind of a two-dimensional coordinate system. It starts here, which is the past, and it moves this way, which is the future. And the thing that we're showing on our coordinate system is, of course, time. Very simple coordinate system for timelines. They move that way. Starting point is just to pick a point in time. That's all we need to do. We could say, well, this is today. Well, if this is today, then I guess this must mean that this is yesterday, and this is probably going to be tomorrow. So all we need to do is pick a starting point, which is a key event, place it on a timeline, and then begin to map in where are other events relative to it. And of course, the relationship of objects within a timeline is there, to be fancy about it, the temporal relationship. Now we might remember that in some of our previous drawings we had a focus on a spatial relationship. In this case, we're not worried about where things are in space. We're worried about where things are in relation to each other in time. Let's look at examples of timelines. And let's start with something simple, one that we see every day. So here's a nice little one. The sun comes up, the sun shines, the sun goes back down, and the moon comes out. So there we have a timeline. What we usually draw to show that something is a timeline is we draw a set of little arrows. Now, if we look at a sequence like this, we recognize that it's probably going to cycle back, because after the moon, well, we're probably going to get the sun to come back up again. So another way we can draw a timeline, although this is the standard, which is to show them as a line, we can draw a timeline as a circle, and I could say, well, there's an egg, and I don't know, there's a chicken, one of the world's uglier chickens, and we could make our timeline go in a circle. And we could say, well, you know, which one came first, the chicken or the egg? And if we come up with a nice circular timeline, we can indicate, well, because it keeps rolling around, we don't really need to know which one came first because they just keep cycling back. Something interesting, though, when we're drawing timelines is that it turns out that human perception, it's a little bit tricky for us to see things that move in a cycle, especially when there's a lot of steps there. We do seem to have kind of a preference for just showing things in a line. It's a little bit easier for us to look at, and if we want to show that they cycle back, then we can just put a little hook to indicate that. And so what we did then from timelines is we could say, well, let's make a straight timeline. And I was recently doing a little bit of research on the history of search, the history of online search, and I could draw for you a little timeline of what I was able to find out. And so I think if we go back to 1991, let's just set up our timeline. Event number 1, remember how we do this? We set up a coordinate system, we pick timeline number 1, and a company called AOL was quite prominent in search back in 1991. And then let's figure out, where's our timeline going to end? Well, it's going to end pretty close to where we are now, let's say in the year 2009. Most recent big launch of a search engine was Microsoft's Bing. And in between, we're going to find that there is kind of a specific time. So in 1994, we had Lycos. And in 1995 was the launch of a little search engine called Yahoo. And then if we skip a little bit, we go to 1998, was another little search engine called Google. And so here's what we've done is we've just created a timeline showing the history, the passage of a series of events in temporal order. Woo. Temporal order. So that's, of course, what a timeline is. Well, now, you know, we can make a timeline like that, something where we've got a fixed date. We can make that even more elaborate. So say, for example, it was back in 1961 when President Kennedy, very handsome man, of course, got up there and said, you know, we should go to the moon. We should take this nation and go to the moon. Let's go to the moon. And not only are we going to go to the moon, which is great because we can all see it, very nice for those of us who remember maps as a way of indicating where we want to go. Very nice one, because here's a map that we can look up in the night sky every night and see where we're going. That's cool, unless you happen to work for NASA, at which point you're more concerned that he said we're going to do this by 1969. And now you're not so concerned about where we're going, but you're very concerned about when? When are we going to do all these things in order to get to the moon by 1969? So what you do is you draw a timeline. And we're going to find in a moment that this becomes a very specific type of a timeline, where what you do is you say, you pick the date that you need to meet and you put it at the end. And that was, in Kennedy's case, 1969. We need to have completed our objective of gotten to the moon. Well, we're back here in 1961. So let's create a timeline that indicates all the things we need to do, all we need to do to get there on time. What are all the things we need to do to get there on time. So there's a bunch of things if you're at NASA. We need to develop the booster rocket. We need a big old rocket to get us out of Earth's atmosphere. And then to run that rocket, we need to develop some kind of fuel that we can burn. And then on top of that rocket, we need to have some kind of spacecraft. And inside that spacecraft, we're certainly going to need to have some people. I mean, the whole point is to get people to the moon. And then we're going to have to test all of this. We're going to have to stick all this stuff together, our rocket with our fuel in it, with our spacecraft on it, with our people inside. We're going to have to test all that, and then eventually we're going to have to launch that thing, and that's how we're going to get to the moon. So what we see here is something that became known as a Gantt chart, named after Henry Gantt. Henry was a big project manager in 1900 up to about 1914, so right around the time and up through the end of 1918, World War I. And he was really big on making charts like this, Gantt charts, timelines that would be able to show you when everything needs to happen. So these became, of course, very popular, and what we end up with today is all kinds of different software, whether it's Microsoft Project or Open Project or things that are ways to make really complex Gantt charts. And who are the people who really love timelines? Well, those of us who really love timelines are the timekeepers. Someone looking at my watch, keeping track of the tick, 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 tick. Are we getting everything done? We tend to be the program managers and the project managers and the people who are responsible for keeping track of scheduling. The problem with these wonderful Gantt charts, which can show all of the things that need to get done and all of the whens that they need to happen, and then they can even map out in this nice visual form as to show when they need to happen. The problem with these is that if we're not a project manager and we look at one of these things, we have a tendency to scream and say, oh my God, what? Because I can't really see very well when I fit in here, and what are these linkages? So one of the things that I often recommend to project managers is it's incredibly powerful to go ahead and make your complete Gantt chart to show your entire project. But when it comes time to showing it to your team, do not show them the entire Gantt chart, because most of us just seize up like a brick wall, when we see something like this. No. What we do is we draw. We project managers learn how to draw very simple timelines that say, look, person, what I really need you to do is I need you to do 4 things in this order, and I'll give you a date here, and I'll give you a date here, and here's what I want you to get done along the way. Oh, we say, okay, I see where I fit. So that's what I kind of recommend that we do. Which brings us to a nice segue, I suppose, into the questions of, well, when do we use timelines? When do we care about when things are happening? Well, every time we want to show, obviously, the time relationship of different events is when we want to make a timeline, when we're interested in the time relationship. So what that really means is, okay, well, when did it happen? When did that thing happen? Well, are we picking a particular date? We could be, but just picking a particular date all by itself isn't usually that interesting. What we want to know is, when did it happen in relation to other events? Not just a date, but a sequence of dates. So in fact, one of the ways that we can map that out is, very simply, we can imagine that every timeline, every sequence of events automatically has 3 built-in points that we're interested in. There is, when does it happen? Kind of where we are right now. When did it happen? Which, is easy to think of as the past. And when will it happen? Which, of course, is the future. So, anytime we want to understand the relationship of did, does, and will, we want to go ahead and create a timeline. And what's interesting about that is whenever we want to show, of course, when there are dependencies. And what we mean by dependencies is, let's say that this thing simply can't happen until that thing has already happened. And that's where we got back into our Gantt chart, because we could show that, well, everything doesn't just run necessarily in one line. There could be these parallel lines, like we saw back with our little NASA chart. And this one can't start until this one is done. So if we want to show when time-based dependencies, again, that's when we want to show a timeline. And lastly, of course, when what we really want to focus on is just the sequence. If we're a project manager and someone has said to, okay, so map out for me, lay out for me when everything's going to happen. What is the sequence of events? What are the dance moves? We're going to do this one, and then we're going to do this one, and then we're going to do the cha-cha-cha switch, and then we're going to jump up in the air, and then we're going to end up right where we started. When we want to know the sequence, what do we draw? You got it. We draw a timeline. And let's conclude with one of the more famous, nice little timelines. So this is going to start out. Let's summarize timelines. And let's draw a nice little stick figure here. And let's give this fellow a crown made of olive leaves, believe it or not. Yes, there he is. And let's give him a little toga. And maybe a spear, perhaps a shield, because we are drawing, of course, Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar is best known for his quote, Veni, Vidi, Vici, which we can map out very well into a nice little timeline that says, I came, I saw, and boy oh boy, I conquered. And that's what the power of a little timeline.